Good day, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is CJ Depperdine. I am with untappedgoldmines.com, and I am blessed and honored to be here today with Dave Snowden, my mentor in all things complexity science. Dave is the founder and chief scientific officer at Cognitive Edge. If you want to look for that website, it's cognitive-edge.com. Dave is a pivotal player in this field of complexity science and complex adaptive systems. Dave's work is international in nature and covers government, industry, and really looking at complex issues as it pertains to strategy and organizational development. And I think that's like, it's just the blanket kind of generalization. There's so much more to Dave's work and Dave's expertise that I couldn't cover it all. So I will be putting his bio or the link to his bio on the page on Untapped Gold Mines where this exists. But is there anything you want to call out in specific, Dave, that you're working on right now, or industries or organizations that you're working with that are relevant to kind of filling in the backstory of what you do and what you do best and who reaches out to you?
These days, I'm more focused on the not-for-profit research center, which I set up called the Cynefin Centre. Though I'm still a founder of Cognitive Edge and still involved in the commercial side. And we're doing a body of stuff. There's a whole, there's a big amount of work around COVID at the moment. And just finishing off the current an EU handbook on how to manage in a crisis, which we'll be publishing in September. And we're doing a lot of work, taking our original work on peace and conflict, and now starting to use that in organizations to identify where there's agreement, where there's disagreement, the nature of the disagreement, and critically defined outliers. So there's a whole body of stuff going around, at the moment. And there's always something new on the field.
There is, yes. I follow closely to a lot of your Twitter profile, your Haunt, which is your premium members section of your website. And I'm constantly seeing new stuff. So when you talk about working in crisis management, what is the body of work that you do most in that area today?
I think this is actually linked in with the Cynefin framework. So kind of like there's a fairly basic set of steps that you go through. I mean, first of all, in a genuine crisis, you need to act very quickly to apply a level of constraint to give yourself breathing space.
Right.
So you can see that done successfully in New Zealand, for example, around COVID, where the Prime Minister just shut down very fast, even when the evidence wasn't completely there that it was a good idea.
Right.
Whereas the UK held back and hoped to, and then discovered they should have done it earlier. So a lot of leadership decisions in a crisis are to do things quickly to keep your options open. Yeah, sometimes before you've got the evidence, but it's better to do something decisively, which holds options open for the future. Yeah. Once you've done that, and this is kind of like a 5-stage process that we've been working through for the handbook, you've got to decide where you're sitting. So there's going to be a whole body of stuff where experts have been telling you something for years and you've been ignoring them. And there's nothing wrong with that, because loads of different experts are constantly telling you different things and you can't satisfy all of them. But now you sort of retrospectively know who was right. So, bring them in, apologize humbly and give them some resources and do what you're told. That's kind of like strategy number one. Strategy number two, and this is actually more common, is you'll have different competing experts who don't agree with each other. So, for example, there was a massive debate in a lot of European countries between behavioral economics and epidemiologists. Two completely different fields, and their advice is irreconcilable. So we've been developing formal techniques for what's called managed conflict in that space, including a technique called the tricopticon, which basically allows a leader to observe a structured debate rather than be subject to multiple lobbies, and to have people who are tangential to the fields or know something about both fields to also interact. So that's a whole process around that we've been developing. Then there's where you've got a series of competing hypotheses, about what should happen, and there's a whole process for rapid parallel experimentation around that. And then the big area, and this links back into the work we do on the peace and reconciliation conflict mapping, is where you do mass engagement of huge numbers of people in situational assessment and micro scenario planning. And from that, you create maps which identify what are the evolutionary possibilities, which includes, what people will buy into, what they won't buy into, what they see differently. And a critical aspect of that from a leadership perspective is what I call finding the 17%. So that links with famous experiments where radiologists were given X-rays, asked to look for anomalies. On the final X-ray, a picture of a gorilla was placed in plain sight.
Right.
And 83% didn't see it, even though their eyes scanned it. And the 17% who did came to believe they were wrong when they talked with the 83%. So this is something which isn't just crisis management, but is critical then. You need to find the people who are seeing things differently. And this is what I originally, a long time ago, produced a matrix which went known unknowns and unknowables, which I presented in Washington one year, and I really then couldn't use it for a bit thereafter. You should never present things in the Pentagon. But one of the key areas there is the known unknowns. Sorry, the unknown knowns, get it the right way around. So they're the things which are known in the organization, which are unknown in the center. And that's kind of like the big opportunity and the big threat. So a lot of the work is then finding that out. So I've summarized what's in the booklet, but getting people into a structured process is key to crisis management. You don't just want to be lurching from one initiative to another, which is what generally happens.
Right. And so when you mention the 17% as kind of being the outliers, I kind of view that as like the untapped gold mines, perhaps the people you aren't listening to in your organization that are watching the organization as a whole, or watching for the signals externally that just internally leadership typically ignores, or just doesn't have the time or the capacity to deal with. So how does an organization start to tap into that 17% once they've identified it? And what are some of the mechanisms that, make the narrative that comes from that 17% valuable to that organization?
Some of it's giving them access to decision makers, but you'll often find they're the cynics. I mean, one of the things I've been saying to leaders for a long time in training is, don't decry cynicism, because it's the cynics in the organization who care about it.
Yeah.
The ones you should really worry about who are parroting back to you the platitudes of your mission statement. The people who always seem to be on message are the ones you should never bloody well trust if you want a general view. It's the people who are cynical, who ask difficult questions. Those are the people you need access to as a leader. What we've generally found, though, is that because we have this, it's called inattentional blindness. We screen out things we don't expect to see. But if we're told there's something we should look at, we pay attention to it. So one of the ways I describe this is when you're kids, you get these sort of line drawing pictures, say, of a park, and you're told there are 15 kitchen utensils hidden in it. Because you know that there's something hidden in it, you find it. But if you didn't know, you wouldn't look.
Right.
Now, that's what we're replicating. So if you know that these 70% sees things differently, and you know the quantitative basis for that, and this is a quantitative technique, not a qualitative one, then you know that these people, you pay attention to what they say, whereas otherwise you would actually dismiss it. Yeah. So I think that's key. I think the other big area in that field, which is a variation on this, is to know where you've got irreconcilable conflict. And this is really important, because you can't get those people to sit down together and have a conversation, because things will get worse.
Right.
You've actually got to find bridging communities. And what you may find is that the 17% are outliers from middle management, but not from you. That's actually quite common. And it's not middle management's fault, because they're focused on process, they're focused on targets, they've got goals to achieve. So things which are coming in left field are bad as far as they're concerned, so they tend to move them away. So
right.
we call it, it's dispositional mapping. You need to understand the landscape in which you're operating before you take action.
Right. And this is what SenseMaker does, if I'm understanding correctly, right?
SenseMaker maps that. And then say we have other techniques. I mean, this is drawn from work, actually, which I originally did in the 70s in Ireland, where we were looking at peace and reconciliation between Catholic and Protestant. Yeah. And from my point of view, and I know this is controversial, there was no point in getting people to sit and talk about how they should really love each other. Something which was wonderfully satirized in episode 1 of series 2 of Derry Girls. If you haven't seen that, you should watch it.
Okay.
Where the Catholic girls are meant to engage in trust exercises with the Protestant boys, all right? It's hysterically funny and it's only too bloody accurate, all right?
Okay.
What we actually did is we took asymmetric groups, so like a couple of Catholics, one Protestant or vice versa, and we sent them into Latin America for 6 months and we didn't talk about the Troubles. So what we did is we took people from different backgrounds and put them in a situation where they would have to deal with things. We didn't try and deal with it for them, which is an adult response. Now we now do that, for example, in system design. So we'll put together a systems architect or a end user tester, somebody who sees a system as a whole, with a bright young programmer, with a user trained to talk to IT people. Because it's easier to train users to talk to IT people than to train IT people to understand users. Right? And there's all sorts of cognitive neuroscience reasons for that I won't go into. So what we'll do is we'll take those 3, but we'll have 15 of those trios working on a problem in parallel and see what they come up with. Now, I might choose the trios from a dispositional map. I might not say these people are seeing it differently, pay attention to them. I might just pick them and put them in with a trio with the people who are thinking differently and focus on the problem so I can get that sort of integration.
Right. So how do we overcome in organizations that barrier that is very obvious and clear when one person is the outlier and they do have an opposing view and anybody else that's in the room is kind of like, we're all of the mind that this is the way that it is and we're not comfortable listening to this. Like there is a discomfort.
You can't overcome that directly. And the trouble with some techniques, which have utility elsewhere, like open space, is they punish people who aren't getting on with everybody else.
Right.
I mean, the law of 2 feet means you can walk away from things you don't want to hear. So, this is the old Cassandra problem, all right? Cassandra is doomed to know the future, but doomed not to be listened to. And that's kind of like one of the common things that you see within organizations. So from our point of view, the general approach to complex change is to approach problems indirectly, not directly.
Right.
So, and the other thing is, the other key lesson which comes out of this is you focus on linkages, not on things. So the traditional OD approach of trying to change people is actually just really bad science. You can't do it, right? Not on a scalable basis. And I'm not sure it's moral to do it either, or ethical. On the other hand, you can change connectivity. You can change linkages. And linkages matter more than things. That's a general principle of complexity science. So what we do with trios is we connect people in different ways. What I might do with that isolated cynic is start to link them with new joiners, or link them with other people. I mean, one of the great things we had in IBM, because I was one of those people, was effectively there was kind of like a court jester thing for senior executives. They almost competed as to who had the most maverick. It was kind of like, well, my Mavericks upset more senior executives this month than your Maverick. It was kind of like, and you were there to speak truth under power. It was rather like the sort of medieval kings. As long as you had your jester costume on, you could say anything to anybody and not get punished for it.
Right.
Right. So some of this is actually giving people top cover, which does not mean giving them endorsement. Yeah, you may actually disagree with them, but you need to give them some sort of protection so they're not hit. And the other thing is access to leadership is something political players in the organization pick up on very quickly. So if a maverick's got access, they'll start to listen and talk with the maverick. Yeah, you don't have to tell them to, but they know that person has got your ear. Yeah, just a very simple sort of quoting something that the maverick said to a large group of people and just not saying anything more will give all the clue you need to the political players who are generally the problem.
Right. And so when there's a heavy stack of kind of political players that are still resistant to that maverick piece and that kind of maverick voice, how do we nudge the system, enough times? Like what does it take? Because yes, the directional trios make a lot of sense because you're distributing the cognition and you're really kind of creating a dialogue that creates new linkages for them. But you can only do that in, let's say, the scheduled amount of time that you have. What do you do after that?
You can do wider than that. I mean, we often link people who've just joined the organization with people about to retire. That's called a transgenerational pair.
Right.
And that actually links in with brain plasticity, that you've got novelty combined with linkages and experience. Yeah, we do that in civil change as well. The other one is kind of like the work we do on SenseMaker, where we can map what are called adjacent possibles. So if you've got a negative cluster, you can find a cluster which is near to it going in the right direction. And then your basic, and this is called vector theory of change, is what you basically say is what I need, guys, is more observations like these and fewer observations like those.
Right.
Or more stories like this, fewer stories like that. You'd make no value judgment. This is simply a description.
Right.
And that's actually quite important in motivation. So we do a lot of this, for example, on safety mapping. So we map attitudes to safety because attitudes are lead indicators, whereas compliance is a lag indicator. So if you say, how do we have a better approach to patient safety? You'll get defensive reactions. Well, we already are. On the other hand, if you gather people's real experiences at a micro-descriptive level without evaluation, you can say, hi guys, we need more stories like this and fewer stories like that. Everybody can buy into it. Yeah.
Right.
And
Because
that's
it's not
kind of like
dismissing.
the new approach to nudge, all right? But you need to know what the adjacent possible is. So you don't want an aspirational goal too far away from where you are. You want an existing set of exemplars that you can nudge people into, which they'll accept as realistic.
Right. And I think I heard about this from your vector theory of change conversation with Sonia. And it was really about creating small nudges as opposed to massive change that is going to upheave, large numbers of people.
Yeah, and I've had a debate with the guy in charge of the nudge unit on this in Downing Street and over the years with many behavioral economics. And I don't think they nudge, they yank.
Okay.
And some of the things we've developed, for example, in South Wales with transgenerational pairs, so that's young people with their grandparents' generation,
right,
is to say to the community, we need more like this and feel like that, but let them generate their own nudges. All right, and that's that the same applies in organizations. It's this distributed sense-making capacity which reduces the energy consumption for the center.
Right.
I mean, and really good leaders just say things every now and then, and things happen. They don't get involved in doing it.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say, I imagine that frees leaders a lot more. And I've been seeing that with just deploying complex facilitations in all of my learning and development at the corporate levels.
You've got to live with failure. I mean, we just put in a big bid this afternoon, and 2 of my staff were working on it. And it was, well, do you want to read for this? Well, no, because if you can't write that stuff by now, why would you be employed?
Right.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing the total price on this and the risk factor. And I'm not even double checking your figures. I just want you to raise it with me and I'll give you some nudges in the right direction. Now, I don't always achieve that. And I do have a control fetish over certain aspects of the software and behavior. And the team will tell you that I can be, people who don't use styles in word processing documents, from my point of view, should be taken out and garroted as an example to the rest of humanity, right? Because I'm the poor sod who has to integrate their material.
Right.
Using 2 carriage returns is a deadly sin, all right?
Right.
At the end of a paragraph, right? But in general, what you're trying to do is to manage, and this is leadership as opposed to middle management, right? You're still managing, right? You're managing a dispositional state, so the energy cost of desirable things is lower than the
Right.
energy cost of undesirable things. If that's where you focus, yeah, life is better for everybody.
Right. So when we talk about the concept of nudges and small incremental changes, I can't help but think about Agile. And you are definitely one of the, top renowned individuals that seems to always show up in these Agile conferences, and everybody knows about you through Agile communities. And so I'm curious to know, when you think about Agile and you think about, let's say, waterfall or traditional, maybe Wagile hybrids or whatever you want to call them, where do you see the differences between a nudge in a non-Agile environment and a nudge in an Agile environment? Are there differences?
That's quite interesting. I mean, I've been in software development all my life, but I didn't come into Agile until fairly late. When a bunch of XP guys asked me to speak at a conference in London, and I explained the Cynefin framework. Now, actually, Cynefin is 21 years old this October,
Happy
and
birthday.
Agile is 20 years old, yeah, round about the same time. So they kind of like grew up in parallel in a similar environment, but then they came together. And yeah, I mean, Cynefin is now extensively used. It's kind of like the dominant complexity framework. I think the reason for that is that it basically said there's nothing wrong with waterfall in the right context.
Right.
Yeah. So if you look at Agile methods, Agile became associated with Scrum for a period, and Scrum is a really important method, but it's part of the total sum of what makes up Agile.
Right.
In Cynefin terms, it's a liminal technique, which makes the complex complicated, which is hugely valuable. So I think one of the reasons Cynefin has been successful is that it basically is a multi-methods approach without being a sort of safe like Borg type environment, which simulates everything. Yeah.
Right.
It basically says different things work in different contexts, choose the right tool for the right job and define the interfaces. So, I mean, I was one of the founders of the SDM consortium, one of the 3 founders, which goes before Agile. And yeah, we developed things like time box techniques there, which have been neglected, but are hugely valuable. Yeah, Scrum is just a particular type of time box, if you want to look at that.
Right.
So I think that's one reason. I think the other thing is we've been looking lately, for example, at distributed stand-ups, because a stand-up is retrospective. In fact, it's called a retrospective, which means you've got dubious data in it. So we're now starting experiments with real-time recording. So we're looking at what people were thinking when they did something, not what they think the next day when they're reflecting back on it in terms of politics. Yeah. And we're also looking at getting rid of things like story points by giving programmers direct access to statistically valid clusters of user experiences. That's called disintermediation, removing the interpretive layers, so that effectively you get a co-evolution between software and need. I often say that the real value of software is when you actually use it, you use existing knowledge to map an unarticulated need. So if in the process of system design, you give users something they didn't know they wanted, but they find intensely useful, you're in a much lower risk profile than if you're just into requirements capture and requirement satisfaction.
Right.
Because, I mean, if I take my gorilla example and the radiologist, that just invalidated any systems analyst. Yeah, I mean, that's 101 science, right? You will not see what you do not expect to see. So all those things you're feeding into the backlog are based on your own personal scanning of what's in front of you. And again, we're trying to make that more directly available.
Yeah, and I know, and I think I've shared with you before, I often use the moonwalking bear video on YouTube, even though it's terribly produced at this point because it's so old. It's quite amazing to me how many people are utterly shocked that they did not see the moonwalking bear the first time. And
it's
to
why
me,
they used the gorilla in the radiologist experiments. It's the same group.
Exactly. Oh, it's the same group. Okay, good to know.
Yeah, and there's a book called The Invisible Gorilla, which they produced, which is worth reading because it was produced by the cognitive neuroscience community, so people would stop taking Malcolm Gladwell's Blink seriously.
Mm.
Because like most of Gladwell's stuff, he's selecting data to inform a hypothesis rather than constructing a hypothesis from the data. But journalists tend to do that.
Right. And that's an important piece I want to kind of segue with, because, the data precedes the framework. That's definitely one of the big lessons that I've gathered from you, which really has shifted the way that I support leaders and really build out learning and development kind of facilitations or workshops. Because the reality is, like, we don't know what we don't know until we get in a room with people. And so we need to be able to really have that dialogue and that narrative. And so when you think about gathering that insight to create organizational sort of design and development, which is something that you've just recently done 6 webinars on. I don't know if you're carrying on with this.
Yeah, the 7th coming up, and we're going to publish a manifesto.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, they're really, really good.
One of those things which has just happened, right?
Yeah, it's fantastic. I would love to link to those as well from the page that I post this on, because it's an incredibly valuable resource. But when you think about equipping tomorrow's or even today's OD professionals with kind of a new mindset, because it is shifting the way OD was traditionally done, what do you think are the key elements for success in this new world we're in for OD professionals?
It's probably 2 or 3, all right? So first of all, you need to manage the present, not the future.
Right.
OD professionals, and I've often said they have CEOs in a Stockholm Syndrome relationship. And the CEO hasn't realized it yet, in this sort of continuous cycle of, change based on idealized future states. And that's bad science. It doesn't work. It just produces gaming behavior. Yeah, the minute you write your values down, you just lost them, is one of the rules here, right? So identifying where we are, what's stable, what's unstable, what needs to be changed, that sort of incremental change, and only do a dramatic or massive change where the system will permit it. So for example, post-COVID, there are opportunities because the system is disrupted. Yeah, but it's rare for that to come along. You're normally better taking an evolutionary approach, right? Secondly, I would actually study different subjects. I wouldn't study OD.
Right.
You probably need to read to be honest, you can study most of OD by reading a half dozen summary textbooks, all right? But what you really need is some cognitive neuroscience, some philosophy, things like, read DeLander on assemblage theory, think about the implications, yeah? Read things about how human beings make decisions, read things on complexity. An OD professional has to be a transdisciplinary specialist, and most of them are actually stuck in an inductive framework. They're working off case studies.
Right.
So the third area, and this is the growing area linked around complexity, it's also what's called the long tail and all these sort of things, is called abductive research, yeah, not inductive. So under conditions of extreme uncertainty, you can't use cases to actually determine what to do.
Right.
And cases, my background's in physics as well as philosophy, all right? From a physics point of view, no social scientist has ever had enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. And management scientists don't tend to even bother with that level of data capture, right? So if you can understand, how people make decisions, how systems work, how narrative patterns form which can't be disrupted, if you've got that basic science behind you, you can adapt to changing circumstances. Yeah. And there's 3 basic principles we talk about on complexity-based consultancy, which are worth repeating here, right? One is granularity matters. Mm-hmm. If you're dealing with highly, big things, they're less likely to change than small things, but if they're too small, you can't control them. So there's an optimal granularity to information units, to organizational units, and so on. We got to 5, 15, 150, 150. If you take the Dunbar number sequence, would be a good starting point there, right? Secondly, you need to distribute cognition. So you need lots of agents interpreting a situation from multiple perspectives. You can't afford for a single point of contact. And then finally, this point I mentioned before called disintermediation. is decision makers have to have access to raw data. I mean, the next generation we're working on SenseMaker at the moment would allow, for example, a prime minister in the UK or a president in the US States, let's take two populists in inverted commas at the moment, to entangle their own timelines with that of ordinary people and to see the similarities between it without any interpretation through reports or anything else. And that process of real-time entanglement is a key thing for leadership, because it's a key part of disintermediation.
Right. So explain for those who are unfamiliar with kind of the concept of real-time entanglement, what that means to you.
Okay, so I've got, say, a set of experiences which I've recorded, yeah?
Right.
What I need to do is to create points of similarity or difference with other people or other people who are working for me. Right? Now, good leaders actually do this naturally. And it's quite interesting. I think since we got into, I'm going down a slight rat hole at the moment, but it's important. When I was growing up, we kind of like went to a state school and we mixed with everybody from multiple backgrounds. And so you learn to have different conversations with different people at different times, yeah, in different dialects, in effect, yeah. These days, people tend to go to elite schools, yeah, and they don't have that ability to have the sort of different conversation. So I do a lot of field ethnography, or used to when I was younger, and literally go in and sweep metal scarf off the floors of factories with apprentices in Glasgow, which I did for 2 days, all right? I learned more as a consultant doing that than any McKinsey's consultant has ever learned about the factory. Right?
Right.
That I could do it because I knew that I'd gone to school with people like those apprentices. I knew the language. I didn't make the mistakes. I knew the form of the conversation. Yeah. So that ability to entangle is problematic in a modern world. So now we're starting to do it with software. So, for example, you've recorded your own experiences, yeah? We will find entanglement points between your lives and the lives of people who work for you and say, have you seen this?
Right.
Yeah? So, and that's to create what's called empathetic resonance, yeah? So you can see things from a different perspective, and you're going to see that through anecdotal data. You're not going to see it through analytical or summary data.
Right. So for those who might be thinking, that's a lot of granularity, that's a lot of like, perhaps an assumption or perception might be it's a bit of a needle in the haystack, and where do I begin and how much time does this take? For those who want just the quick response, how do we say, but wait, this is actually incredibly valuable to you and here's why?
Well, I think you can do the short one, and you can say, go and walk the floor. Yeah, you may need to do that in another company. I mean, famously, with a big British supermarket, I got their executives to go and be bank clerks for a week. And I got the bank executives to go and learn how to stack shelves in the supermarket.
Right.
And they all said it was the most valuable leadership training they'd ever had. And we did nothing but just put them in a very different situation, so they could see something they hadn't seen for a long time. So there's things you can do like that. But I say we can also now do it with the software. So, for example, one of the experimental projects we did with the US Army involved deploying immediate field capture of experiences of company commanders in return for not writing a patrol report. And I've done that with salespeople. So as long as you capture stuff in real time, you won't have to write a sales report every month,
Right.
which you get 100% volunteers for. But then you can entangle yourself with that material. So it's that ability to look at real data, which actually changes people. The minute you have summary data, you've got a problem. So there's long-term solutions, short-term solutions. None of this stuff is particularly difficult. It just requires an open mind. And also, I think curiosity. I think we're starting to lose curiosity in senior executives. Or what Kipling calls, which is my favorite phrase, if you know The Elephant's Child from the Just So stories, who has insatiable curiosity. And I love that phrase. Yeah.
I like that too. So when we take all that data and we've gotten ourselves to that point where we're now understanding the narrative, the entanglements, the possibilities, and the infiniteness, I think, of all of this, how do we make that shift from that base of knowledge and data to strategy now? Because, you know, a lot of companies today are steadfast in their commitment to, these are our KPIs, these are the results, we're going to get the whole team moving in that direction, and that's it, and we're basing all of our performance on these things, where, you know, and I know that change happens all the time. So it's a very
And
potentially
that isn't
dangerous place.
strategy. KPIs are tactics, not strategy.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, there's a thing we developed called apex predator theory, which is an ecological model of strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at it, most current corporate strategy comes from an engineering metaphor, Porter, all of those sort of people. Yeah. So the assumption is you have context-free methods, whereas what complexity tells us is virtually everything in a human system is context sensitive.
Yep.
So if you, let's take the evolution of technology, IBM starts to dominate the computer space from the 1920s. And one of the reasons is it repurposes punch cards. Yeah, it is, and that gives it early mover advantage, right?
Right.
It then becomes so dominant, nobody can disturb it. There was no point in fighting IBM in the 80s. You could have better technology, you could have better software, you'd win a few sales, but fundamentally you were going to lose. Yeah, the adage then came about, nobody got fired for buying IBM. Because once something dominates a market, the safe procurement decision is to go with the market leader, because you won't be blamed if it goes wrong.
Right.
Yeah? But then hardware becomes a commodity. And because IBM was immunized from the commodification, because it was the apex predator, it didn't notice it till it was too late. You almost then had the world's largest ever bankruptcy. It was then at the largest ever loss. Yeah, this is before Gerstner took over. And this rather obscure little software company who'd stolen or borrowed something which IBM had paid them to develop and hadn't realized the significance of, called Microsoft, dominated the space until software itself became a commodity. And then Apple took over and they repurposed next. Every year, these major changes are rapidly repurposing something you're already highly competent at for something novel. That's called an exaptive moment. Yeah?
Right.
Exaptation is the biological process by which a trait repurposes under stress for some completely different function. Yeah, dinosaurs' feathers from warmth to flight, for example. Yeah. So one of the key things you need to do in corporate strategy is know where you are. And this stuff is fractal. It's different at different levels. Are you at an exaptive point? Are you at what Clayton Christian termed the point of competence-induced failure, which is what happens if you don't make the change? So complexity approaches to complex strategy are primarily focused on situational awareness.
Right.
So you know what's possible or not. That's apex predator theory, which is a framework up there with Cynefin in terms of importance. Yeah. Things like KPIs and the like then become tactics.
To execute
and the
on
interesting
strategy.
thing about vector theory of change is it gives you an empirical measurement of direction and speed of travel without endpoints. Because if you start a journey, you're open to novel possibilities.
Right.
Whereas if you have a goal, you don't open up to novelty. So explicit KPIs are really useful for about 80% of what you do, but are totally disastrous for the other 20%. And that's where you need a different approach.
Right.
So I think what you're going to see, I mean, we're working on it now with the EU handbook, all right? But we're also working on it with the book. The time is right now for the book, which is complexity changes the game, like systems thinking changed the game in the 80s. So it's an apex predator moment in its own right. And most of the current, and everybody forgets, the big consultancy firms grew on the back of business process re-engineering, which grew on the back of cybernetics, and it created this market for highly trained analytical teams in large numbers. Yeah. The next generation, which is going to be ecological, which is a major shift in metaphor and practice, is not going to sustain those sort of models anymore. It's actually, ironically, going to be a lot cheaper and a lot faster and a lot more adaptive. And one of the questions for organizations is, do they want to be the dinosaurs post-meteor, or that funny little energy efficiency thing called the first mammal? because the dinosaur is the best thing to be for several million years, but then it's the worst thing to be when you get that moment of change.
Right. And so for organizations that are recognizing that this is probably inevitable for them, they actually see that when they've listened to this, what would you suggest are the first steps that they need to take in order to start moving in that direction?
Okay, so this is actually a set of summaries I've been writing for the EU handbook. So kind of like, you've got the hell out of the crisis. What do you do now so it makes it easier
Right.
next time?
Right.
First of all, you need to build informal networks.
Right.
There's a technique we use called social network stimulation, which means everybody is within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else within 18 months. And that's kind of like the fungus which sustains plant roots. You won't know exactly what it is, but without it, you've got a problem.
Yep.
So build your informal networks, manage them, target HR on maintaining them, but that doesn't mean you control it. You will never quite know who is connected with who, but you need to know the network density is high. So that's kind of like lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, your whole workforce has to become a distributed sensor network. And that needs to be a routine task as well as an extraordinary task, because you need to get those perspectives. You need to find the 17%, in terms of the way it works. And the third thing is you need to create time to think. One of the best executives I knew at Boeing, and it was a huge loss when he left Boeing, right? He would actually lock his executives away, and this is a very senior, right? Would lock the executives away for me somewhere in California once a year to actually update themselves on science and art and things they hadn't even thought about. And that guy always had time, but he was a very effective leader. And it's that ability to be reflective, to be transdisciplinary, which we're losing. I mean, I'm just putting together a new MBA with the University of North Texas. Things are going much faster in a crisis, right? Which effectively is transdisciplinary. So you don't study cases, you study science and the humanities, and then you apply that learning to real world cases. And I think we're about to enter an age of the new generalist. And the educational system doesn't throw them out at the moment, so we're going to have to do it as a postgraduate function. But you need generalists, and you need to find them fast, and you need diversity in your team. And you also need to use consultants in a different way. I mean, I had the privilege of teaching leadership with Peter Drucker on several executive seminars. Well, he beat me up first and decided I was retrievable and took me out for dinner. So that it goes from that, right? But I remember asking him somewhat mischievously, we were running this in the Hotel del Coronado, if you know that, which is where they filmed Some Like It Hot, wonderful hotel, off the coast of San Diego. And we had 30 CEOs, and we were training them in leadership for 3 days. It was a huge privilege to be doing that with Peter, right? And I somewhat mischievously over a dinner asked him, what do you think the role of consultants is? And he grinned because he knew I was provoking him. And he said, they're meant to be butterflies, to fly around and pollinate the plants, but not do the work. And he said, that's what's gone wrong. People are now handing over work they or their staff need to do to consultants, and you've just rented their knowledge, you don't own it.
Right. And so when we think about the internal consultants, the people that are willing to have that voice, and they may be the mavericks, the 17%, or they may be just the experts that have been there for a long period of time, what is their role in this to kind of create this new world?
It's the same principle. It's like I've always been saying to people in knowledge management, that your danger is now people will think they don't have to do knowledge management because you're responsible for it.
Right.
The reality is, these things are distributed anyway, right? We've been doing work lately on how do you keep your retired workforce in your sensor networks, because they've got knowledge you can't capture at the time, but you may need it 10 years hence. You just don't know. So I think the role of internal consultancy comes back to what I just talked about. It's creating and maintaining those informal networks. It's using distributed intelligence rather than their own intelligence to provide advice. It's understanding context. It's creating what we call anticipatory alerts. Something is happening here you should pay attention to. Not this is what I think you should do.
Right. So I would
The,
imagine, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that one of the principles, there's a couple of key principles we work on. One is called bounded applicability. Different things work in different contexts. The other is called descriptive self-awareness. Decisions come to people who can describe what is happening to them and understand what it means. They're not given to you by advisors. So one of the roles of a consultant is to enable that process.
Right. So I would say the consultants of tomorrow, whether internal or external, really need to start thinking about making that shift, if I'm understanding you correctly.
If you want a midwife, sorry, if you want a metaphor, you should be a midwife, not a consultant. So the midwife goes into the home, helps the woman give birth and retires without taking the credit. The consultant throws a horizontal, gives her anesthetic, produces the baby and claims the credit. So think midwife, not consultant.
Right. But how do they become hands off? It sounds to me like they need to make that shift to being the facilitator of dialogue.
Ask questions, present things.
Right.
Try not to have quite so many workshops.
Right.
Because workshops are really not a good way of doing this, because the facilitator dominates the group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and people, you know, this is the criticism of participative action research and open space and everything else. So link and connect. I mean, I was an internal consultant within strategy in the company which was bought by IBM. I think I spent 75% of my time just walking around the building, having chats with people.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and finding interesting things and connecting people. And I remember working with a company called Lend-Lease, who were brilliant. I mean, they got taken over by some Harvard idiots and then they went back to the original. But they had a team of 3 people, and all I did was to fly around the world and beat up project managers. We created a teaching story for them to get people ready for this. This is an Australian company which says the corporate seagull came in and just shat all over me. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is Australian humor, right? But basically what they did is they beat everybody up so you knew, and they always found holes, but then they'd suggest you talk with somebody, but they never give you a solution.
So
and there were no project reports, there were no formal structures, there were no KPIs. It's just every month these guys would fly in and they beat you up. Lovely. And that was extremely effective. And I remember, I mean, it's a good story on this. So I was with Stuart, who was brilliant, right? And we just done some lessons learned. So we'd gone around and we tried to get failure stories, which is normally really difficult, but failure stories are what you want. And I remember the first workshop and somebody said, oh, do you want my crane story, do you? And lobbed out this story of complete and abject failure where they'd lost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then that happened in the second workshop and it happened in the third workshop. And I remember going to Stuart and said, what is it with this crane story thing? And he looked at me and he said, I wondered if you'd find that out. So that was obviously a test. And he said, well, it all comes from an incident. We had a civil engineer, who was trained in Alice Springs, which is right in the middle of Australia, by correspondence course. So he knew about tides in theory, but not in practice. And his first job was Sydney Harbour. So he tied the floating crane and didn't take account of tidal movement. So the floating crane was lost. Millions of dollars cost. And he said, his boss phoned me up and said, we probably got to fire him, but I think he might be retrievable. Would you mind taking him out for lunch? So Stuart said, so I took him out for lunch, decided he was a good guy. So I told him that he was now a real engineer because he'd lost his first crane. He said, then I told him in no uncertain terms what would happen to him if he ever did it again. And he said, ever since that, everybody on their first mistake, I have to take them out for lunch and go through the same routine. I thought, you are really one clever bastard, because you've ritualized failure as a learning mechanism.
Right, which is fantastic. And what a great way to kind of end our time together today, because I was just recognizing within myself that every time I think I've started to understand all the things that make up this wonderful complex adaptive systems and Cynefin framework and sense making framework and all the stuff that I've learned from you, there's always more to learn. So I thank you so much, Dave. I'm just curious to know, what is the last piece of advice that you would give leaders today, or resource that you would say every leader needs to go do this thing in order to survive tomorrow's world, or really be adaptive and kind of, tap into that space of making the shifts? that are required.
Go and read some challenging books. Stop reading station bookshelf books on how to be a great leader. Anything which says the 7 characteristics of should be burnt.
Right.
Yeah, read some hard books. Go and talk to some difficult people. Yeah, ask difficult questions and stop making quite so many decisions.
I like that. That's good advice. Difficult book number 1 on your list. What would you say that might be?
It depends on your background. I mean, I'm reading Dana Haraway's book at the moment, which is really scary, all right? But I wouldn't recommend that as a start.
Okay.
I think it has to be to the individual. I mean, remember when I was young, I got a prize, a £60 prize at school,
Yep.
which is £800 in current day's terms, or $1,000. And you were meant to buy something really big. And I just went to the local bookshop with my dad with his car, and I just bought 150 books.
Oh, wow.
And just put them in the lift. And it was philosophy and politics and history and science and stuff like that. It was just anything which struck my fancy. So go into a good university bookshop, hunt around, and the right books will call out to you. Yeah.
Excellent.
Read about how people make decisions, read about systems. Don't read the popular books, read the science books.
Right. Love it. And I'm on that journey now. I'm almost into Design Unbound number 2. Great
Yeah,
books,
by Anne,
but
that's brilliant, right?
yeah.
Alicia's I mean, the Harvard bookshop for me is the perfect one. I mean, it's my mecca. Whenever I'm on the East Coast, that's where I go. And I've never come out with less than 2 bags of books.
Oh, wow. Nice. Okay. Thank you again for everything, all your wisdom.
The MIT bookshop, not the Harvard one. I made a mistake there. I really apologize.
No worries. Okay. All
Okay.
good. I haven't been there. So either which way, somebody hopefully on that side of the world will jump in there to that MIT bookshop. So I will reference these wonderful gems that you've shared today. And again, thank you for always being, that adaptive leader in my world, because you're always kind of finding the next new thing to keep us on our toes, which is great. I love it. Thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great. Pleasure.
Okay. Take care.